Oh boy, today is a great one. Today is talking about what led to the establishment of the Federal Reserve. We just have so many great lectures coming up. This one, and they all tie together well. Like, this ties to the gold standard lecture. This is going to tie into the Great Depression, the Great Recession. Oh my goodness, we have so much to talk about with the Fed. But to start off with, I want to talk about financial terms. Make sure that we understand all the different finance terms. We're on the same page. And then I'll get into the story of the Panic of 1907, which lays the groundwork for the establishment of the Federal Reserve. The first thing we want to do is understand the difference between banks and trusts. Now, there were two types of banks at the time. There were national banks and state banks. We don't care too much about the difference between those. And then there were trusts. And we kind of talked about trusts when we talked about big business and monopolies, because trusts were holding a lot of these monopolies. They were a financial organization that allowed them to get really big business. Well, trusts were a way to also invest in these businesses. You could put tons of money into these trusts, and then they could invest that money for you and get really big returns. But here's the catch. Banks were subject to regulation. There were certain rules they had to follow. There were certain precautions they had to take. Trusts, even though they acted like banks, did not have those regulations. They had none of those regulations. A really important one is the reserve requirement. Banks had to have a reserve in there. A really important one is the reserve requirement. I'm going to talk about that in just a few seconds. Let's get on to the growth of trusts, because trusts at the beginning of the 1900s were growing like crazy. Here's a table of the total assets in each of these financial institutions, and you see that in 1897 most of the financial assets were in national banks and state banks, really mostly in national banks, and then you got like a little bit in trusts. And suddenly by 1907 trusts have grown like crazy. The other ones are growing too, but trusts have the fastest growth rate at this time. So trusts are becoming a dominant financial institution, yet there are no regulations. They are not required to follow any rules. Just a quick note on fractional reserve banking, the second term that we want to cover. Fractional reserve banking is this idea of how the banking system can actually play a role in the monetary system. Money sitting in a bank is no good for that bank. They want to match that money with opportunities for innovation, for investment. They don't want it sitting in the vault. Remember, banks are like Tinder for money. So having it sit in the vault is bad. But you also need some money in the vault because people expect to be able to get money when they come in and they ask for a withdrawal. So you have this tension where you want money out and you want it out there in the world, but you also need to have some at home. You don't want to get all of it. But the more you have in the vault, the less money that you're making. So banks will hold on to a portion of their cash. They'll have it in the banks, in the vault, so that way you can come in and take it out. And then the rest of it, they'll lend out. And then those people, when they borrow that money, they put it in their banks and it gets put out there. And so you have a fraction of your cash as a reserve in the bank. So that's fractional reserve. The rest of it goes out to the world. And this brings us to the reserve requirement. One of the main regulations of banks at this time was the reserve requirement. It was how much of your liabilities had to be in the bank at the time. Liabilities were the deposits. People have come in and they put their money in your bank. You want to get some of it out. How much of it are you allowed to get out? How much of it are you supposed to keep in the vault? So there was a reserve requirement that said you have to keep this much of your liabilities in the vault. So the state and national banks historically had one around like 25%. I'm sure there's lots of variation there, but like it was on the order of 25%. The reserve requirement today was 10%, and then actually in response to the pandemic, Jay Powell got rid of reserve requirements. I don't know what the effect of this has been. It seemed like a really big deal when I saw that announcement, but so far I haven't seen anyone really talk about it. But it was generally about 10% was the reserve requirement. But let's think historically, let's say it's 25%. That means, you put in $100 in the bank, $25 has to stay in that bank. The other $75 can be lent out. Trusts do not have a reserve requirement. They do not have to have 25% of that cash on hand. They can lend out 90%. They could lend out 95%. They can lend out whatever they want. They're gonna be personally constrained to do that because of course people are going to want to be able to have access to their cash. but they can get a lot more of their money out into the world to be used in investments. That's why part of the reason why you could get such high returns on your investment is you just have more turns to get money. So let's talk about bank runs. Bank runs are like toilet paper. You remember with the pandemic and how we couldn't find toilet paper anywhere? And it's not because all of a sudden we needed more toilet paper. It's not like the pandemic was even related to your bathroom behavior, but it was just people were in fear of whether they'd be able to get toilet paper. So people went out and bought all that toilet paper. And then because everyone was buying toilet paper, everybody else was worried that they couldn't get toilet paper. So they run to the store to get toilet paper, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy where suddenly there was no toilet paper in stores. This is exactly what a bank run is like. You might be worried that your bank is going to fail, that it's not going to be around. We don't worry about this as much today, but historically, banks could fail on any given day. So if your bank failed, you wouldn't have any money left. So if you heard that your bank might fail, you might run to the bank and try and get your money out. Well, if enough people think that, they're gonna run to the bank and they're gonna take out their money, and they might actually cause that bank to fail. Well, if enough people are doing that and you think that that bank's gonna fail, you also run there. So that way you get your money before your bank fails. And it just becomes a disaster, right? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where it's rational in a sense, right? Because you think everybody else is going to go get their money out, and you want to make sure that you get your money out too. And keep in mind, there's a reserve requirement. This bank does not have all of their money on hand at the time, so they can't give everybody their money back right away. So that becomes a really tough situation, and you actually want to go and get your money out so that way you don't lose. And as a result, even though there could be nothing wrong with the bank. Now, there could be something wrong with the bank, but there might be nothing wrong with the bank, but it could fail just because enough people think there's something wrong with the bank. For a bank run, it's really important to know the difference of a bank being illiquid versus insolvent. Now, illiquid means that the bank is a healthy bank. It has money, but it just can't get that money right now. The way I think about this is illiquid. It's not a liquid. So I like to think of like money frozen in a block of ice, and that's not a liquid right now, but if you just were to give it time to melt, you could get that dollar bill out of the ice and you would have your situation, right? You have enough assets to cover your liabilities. You are a healthy bank. You just can't get it right now because those assets are tied up in somebody else's house, right? That loan has been made for a mortgage in somebody's house, and as they pay it back, you can get those assets. They're in this person's business, right? Like they're spread out all over the place. They're good, healthy businesses, good, healthy homes. You just can't get access to that money right now. Insolvent is a different case. Insolvent means you do not have enough assets to cover your liabilities. Insolvent means you are a failing bank. Even if you were to go out and get all of your assets from the world, you got every loan to pay you back, you would not have enough money to pay back your depositors. Now, how do you get into a situation like this? Well, you might be making bad loans. You might be spending $1.8 billion on a short video service that fails in a few months. Well, they're not going to be able to pay back their loans very well, right? You might be giving people money for houses, and their houses, like these people lose their houses. They're not able to spend that much money to recover them, whatever it is. You are just you're lending out this money to different people, and those entities fail. They can't pay back their loans. Now you don't have enough money to cover your deposits. You are insolvent. I like to think about insolvent versus illiquid with like Thor's hammer, right? Like in the first Thor, Mjolnir is in the crater or whatever, and like it's there. Mjolnir is there. Thor just can't get access to it yet. He needs to wait. He has time, and then eventually he's able to recover it. Versus Thor Ragnarok, where Hela destroys that hammer, and he has no access to the hammer anymore. Or you can think about it like brooms in Harry Potter. So when Harry Potter's broom crashes into the Whomping Willow, he is insolvent. His Nimbus 2000 is gone. There's just no opportunity. Even if he waits the entire series, he's not getting that broom back. when his firebolt was confiscated by McGonagall, he was insolvent. He had a broom, he just didn't have access to the broom at that moment, and if he waited, eventually he would get it. Now let's get into the stock market. These are the last terms that we need to understand before we get into the Panic of 1907. Let's imagine first purchasing stocks. You're probably more familiar with purchasing stocks, you little Robin Hood traders. You probably are more familiar with shorting as well, since you guys are crazy gamblers on Robinhood. But let's just explain this from the beginning for everybody. If you purchase a stock, you go out and you buy a certain amount of value in a company. And if that company's value increases, then your investment increases. And if their value decreases, your investment also decreases. You're buying stock in that company, and your financial fate is tied to how well that company does. And it goes in the same direction, right? They do well, you do well. They do poorly, you do poorly. Short selling is like purchasing stocks, but in reverse. And sometimes it's really hard to wrap your mind around what's going on. Let's use a phone as a way to just kind of make this make more sense. Let's say you think phones today are really high value, and in the future they're going to go down in value. So what you might do is you say, hey, can I borrow your phone? And I'll get you a new phone in the future, right? Like, obviously phones have their limitations because like this has like personal information on it, but let's just imagine it's something that you don't care if you get your exact phone back or if you get a brand new phone that's the same version. You just want that thing back. Someone's borrowing this thing. So you borrow someone's phone, you sell it, the price goes down the next year, next week, whatever it is, you buy a replacement phone and you give it back, okay? So this guy started with a phone, ends with a phone. Maybe you pay him a little bit of interest or rent, basically, for the ability to borrow that phone in the first place. So hey, this guy's happy because he gets his phone back and he gets a little bit on top of that. You are excited about this because you sold the phone at like $100. You bought a new one at $50. And now you have $50 extra, right? You sold it for $100. You had to spend $50 of that to get the replacement phone. But now you have $50 left over. You have made money because the price of phones went down. Now, instead of a phone, imagine this is a stock. Somebody has stock in a company. You say, hey, can I borrow your stock? You borrow the stock and you sell it at a high price. Now the stock's value goes down and you buy back the stock that you give back to the person you borrowed from plus some interest, right? They get their stock back, but now you have made a profit off of selling this today. So this is called short selling. You think the value of that stock's going to go down, so you short it and you sell it at the high price, you buy it back and you get that difference. And you might say, like, why is this guy think that that's a great move? Well, because this guy thinks that the stock is going to go up in value. And so he's lending it to you. You're going to give it back to him at that higher value plus interest on top of that. This person's winning if the stock value goes up. Now this person loses if the stock value goes down. It goes, this is how markets work, right? You have people who have different beliefs about what's going on in the economy. Some think things are going to do well, some think things are going to go poorly. And the way that we figure out these things in the long run is just how many people think it goes bad versus how many people think it goes good and how much money they're willing to put on it, right? Like, this is what trade is all about. One key here is that short selling makes money when the stock value goes down and it loses money when the stock value goes up. And you can lose a ton of money if the stock value goes up. Like, it is insane. Just this past October, a year ago, there were a whole bunch of Tesla short sellers who lost a combined $1.5 billion in one day because Tesla stock went up when they all predicted that it was going to go down. All right, we now have the vocabulary to establish the Panic of 1907. Now, maybe we went into a little bit more detail than you needed on these things, but they're good financial terms for you to know just generally. But the Panic of 1907 really just has this great story. It has this cinematic quality to it where it just, if it wasn't the fact that a billionaire is the hero of the story, it would definitely be made into a movie. And actually, I think it's a shame that we don't understand this story because A lot of us understand the stories behind the American Revolution, right? And the American Revolution is what eventually leads to us establishing the three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, right? Those are three branches of government that come from the toils of the American Revolution. Well, the Federal Reserve is basically the fourth branch of government today. And the Panic of 1907 leads to the establishment of the Federal Reserve. So we should understand the origin story of this superhero so we can actually understand how to address Fed policy today. This is just so understood, so poorly understood. We need to make sure people know this one. This all starts with Augustus Heinz, not a guy who makes ketchup. He's actually in the copper business. Actually, for those of you watching from Utah, if you go down to, I can't remember where in Utah, but he had copper mines out in Utah. There's a town called Coppertown, and it's, is it right by Harriman? It's probably further north. I can't remember. I'm sorry. Heinz had copper mills out here. Heinz was big in the copper business, and he said, you know what, I'm tired of mining the copper. I want to go into finance and make money on Wall Street in copper. And he has this genius idea. He's going to corner the copper market. He's going to go around and buy up all of the stocks for copper, and he's going to send the value shooting up. Now, there would be a bunch of short sellers who would think that the value of copper was going down. So he was going to drive the price up. He was going to go to the short sellers. The short sellers who thought it was going to go down, they would now have to buy the stocks from him at a super high price. He was going to make a ton of money off of this. He thought this was just the vacuum sealed, airtight way to go about and make a ton of money on Wall Street. This is super unethical, by the way. You should not be trying to corner the market. There are certainly tons of problems with this today. So his plan is working the way he wants it to, and he gets to the short sellers and says, hey, time for you to buy stock from me so that way you can pay off all these debts. But he's overestimated how much of the stock that he owns. He thinks he has the entire market, and it turns out there are a lot of other people who have the stock. Well, if you have all these people who are suddenly willing to buy copper stock at super high prices, all those other people are coming out and saying, yeah, buy my stock, buy my stock. Well, that supply gets pushed up on the market. And what happens when supply goes up? Prices go down. And basically overnight, the stocks for copper collapsed. His whole plan was ruined because he overestimated how much of the stock he owned. A lot of this stuff happens in October, by the way. We're in October right now. A lot of this stuff happens around October. So it was $62 per share in October 14th, and it dropped to $15 per share by October 16th. A huge loss in value in, basically overnight. Well, the problem wasn't necessarily the fact that this cornering the market scheme failed. The problem was that he had partnered up with the Knickerbocker Trust Company. This was a trust that had lent money to him to go through and buy up his scheme. So they were the ones financing his whole copper scheme. Well, when he failed, people realized that the Knickerbocker Trust Company was tied up in this and that they might fail with him. So the depositors descend on Knickerbocker Trust Company demanding their money back. This is a bank run. They're showing up and they're saying, hey, we want our money back because we think that you're going to fail. And because other people are running, other people join them, it becomes that bank run. So the National Bank of Commerce tries to prop up the Knickerbocker Trust Fund, tries to, support it through this bank run, and then eventually says, yeah, we can't keep financing this. Well, what kind of calming sensation is that going to give you if you think the place that holds your money no longer has a financial institution backing it? So depositors become even more terrified and they're rushing in on Knickerbocker Trust Company, and it fails. So remember, it was October 14th, stocks were at $62. October 16th, they had fallen to $14, right? That's when this stock collapsed. By October 21st, Knickerbocker Trust Company had paid out $8 million in less than 4 hours, and they ran out of cash. This is where the hero of the story appears, but a lot of people don't like to call him the hero of the story. J. Pierpont Morgan is, you might notice those initials are JP Morgan. JP Morgan is a huge bank today. This is the guy who started it, right? JP Morgan was this huge financial powerhouse back in the day. He was known for mergers. He would just bring all of these companies together and he would combine them into one mega company. He was a monopolist as true as they come. He was incredibly financial savvy. He was incredibly rich, and people turned to him in this moment of need. Because Morgan had the financial acumen to evaluate these companies and say, is this a company that we should prop up and let it survive? So he's being asked to come in and say, please support the Knickerbocker Trust Company. We need somebody to help out here. The problem, though, is that he is not in New York. He lives in New York, but right now he's not in New York. He's at a church retreat in Virginia. And nobody wants to rush him to New York, because if news gets out that they had to rush JP Morgan away from his church retreat to get here, that's going to cause huge problems. So instead, he has to just sit in his little train car and just slowly go down the tracks to get to Wall Street. This is where it gets really cinematic, right? Everything is burning down and the person to rescue it can't rush to get there. He has to just take his time. Otherwise, he'll cause bigger problems, and they want to avoid that at all costs. So I talked about October 21st was the day that they paid out $8 million in 4 hours. Well, the day before that, October 20th, that's when he's taking his train car back. And part of this is evaluating Knickerbocker Trust Company. They're looking at the books. They're trying to figure out, is this a company worth saving? And the analysis comes back and says, Knickerbocker Trust Company is insolvent. Remember what insolvent means. Insolvent means you do not have enough assets to cover your liabilities. That means you are bankrupt. You do not have the opportunity to get out of this mess. That means that even if JP Morgan props this thing up, he will not get his money back. He will lose a ton of money just trying to keep this one company in business. So he decides, nope, we're not going to save this company. They're a failing business. Anything we do would just contribute to failure. So Morgan lets Knickerbocker fail. It never recovers. It has a tragic story behind it. But let's move on to the Trust Company of New York. So the next day, October 22nd, again, you do not need to know the exact dates. I just bring them up to let you know how quickly all of this was unraveling. So Knickerbocker Trust Company is failing on October 21st. That's a Monday. The next day, the Trust Company of New York is facing some problems. There's a bank run there where people are trying to pull out their money. Well, the next day on October 23rd, there was an article in the New York Times that said, hey guys, Knickerbocker Trust Company failed, and we think Trust Company of New York is the next sore point. This is the place where people should be worried. Well, imagine waking up and reading the newspaper seeing, hey, this is the place that's going to fail. What is your natural reaction going to be? You have to run there. You want to make sure you get your money out of there, because if everybody thinks it fails and everybody else pulls out their money, it will fail. So you have to get there first, and therefore you're guaranteeing that it's going to fail just by printing this article. Over the next 2 weeks, depositors withdrew $47.5 million. They were just draining the Trust Company of New York of their resources. Morgan is asked to come in again. They evaluate the books and they say, you know what? Trust Company of New York is illiquid. It's not insolvent, it's illiquid. Remember, illiquid is the money frozen inside the ice. Give it time and they can get their money. This is a good company if we just give them time to access their resources. So Morgan coordinates this effort to go in and rescue the Trust Company of New York. He gets his boys, they go in. Even though they're perceived as villains, they save the financial system. It doesn't immediately stop at this moment. There are a few other points, but basically the pattern is established, where Morgan will look for whether a company should survive or not, and then he will lend the company money to help them get through the panic. He becomes the hero. People would champion him as he walked down the street. They would see him and they would cheer. Morgan's the one who saved us. Until a little bit later, they're worried. This guy, this single guy, saved the financial system. Is that the kind of world we want to live in, where one person saves the financial system? The government couldn't do anything. In fact, the government was going to Morgan and saying, please help us. And they were going into his office. He wasn't going to the White House. They were coming to him and saying, what do you need us to do? And people got worried that this one guy had so much power. Is that really the financial system we want to construct? And this is what leads to the creation of the Federal Reserve. There was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and this is where the U.S. decided to take control of monetary policy, to have a governing body that could react to panics like this. They've been plagued with panics. We haven't talked about all the panics that were happening. And they realized that one way to solve this was to create the Federal Reserve, to have some sort of regulatory agency over the financial services. The act required all national banks to participate in the Federal Reserve System. Banks would buy into the system, they would own stock. There was a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C., and 12 regional banks. You can see them on this map right here. And it's a little different from today. Today, the regional banks just execute the policy that's decided in DC. Back then, regional banks could actually do their own policy. They could look at the region that they govern and say, this is how we're going to handle financial situations in our region. The main goal of the Federal Reserve, especially at this time, was to provide liquidity for people who had the assets, but they just couldn't get them right now. Basically, it's like a bank can point to the dollar bill frozen in the ice and say, hey, I have money, I just can't get to it right now. Will you please lend me money and I will get that money back to you when I can finally access it. And the reason why the Fed could do this is because they have their own reserves, and they also can just print money. They can provide that money to people, and they always have liquidity available. That the Federal Reserve by nature has liquidity available. They also act as a lender of last resort, which means if you need to just borrow money and nobody else will lend you money, you can go to the Federal Reserve. This historically has had issues because basically if you borrow from the Federal Reserve, you're telling everybody that no one trusts you anymore and they don't want to lend to you, which means you probably don't want your money there. They're trying to get rid of that stigma, and more recent Federal Reserve cases, they have these clearinghouse, like big businesses will go in and borrow money just to show everybody that it's fine to borrow money from the Federal Reserve. But you can actually get loans from the Federal Reserve, or you can just like, hey, I need liquidity, please help me and I'll pay you back, which is basically a loan as well, but slightly different. The Federal Reserve has a mandate to stabilize prices and maximize employment. There's a bit of a trade-off there, but they're trying to make sure that monetary policy keeps the U.S. on a steady economic path, and they're often the ones responding to economic disasters. Today, historically, they actually caused economic disasters, which we'll get to in a few lectures. And another thing about the Fed is that they are independent. They are politically independent. Now, the president will nominate a chair for the Federal Reserve and will nominate people to be placed on board. The Senate confirms them, but once those people have been confirmed and they're serving in the Federal Reserve, they have no political, I don't want to say accountability, but they aren't voted in. Like the president traditionally by custom shouldn't be telling them what to do. We want political independence because this is our economy. We want to make sure that you don't want a Federal Reserve chair who's like going to tank the economy to make a presidential candidate look poor, or make the economy go a little bit overboard to try and make them look good. Like you want that Federal Reserve chair to act independently of politics. And this is super important to have for a good functioning economy.